18 million Americans watched in stunned silence as Jasmine Crockett shattered Jim Jordan's entire career with just 41 words. The setting? A live congressional hearing, C-SPAN cameras rolling, and 8 survivors' voices hanging in the air like a verdict. Jordan, once the king of shouting others down, couldn't say a single word back. If the loudest man in Congress finally went silent, what truth was too powerful for him to face? This is a story worth every second of your time. The Capitol windows rattled with late afternoon wind, but inside her office, everything was still. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat behind her desk, her eyes fixed on a folder as if it might catch fire. The label on the thick-buckled spine was handwritten black ink, slightly smudged, Ohio State vs. Jim Jordan, sealed sworn statements. The paper inside wasn't just heavy, it felt heavy as if soaked with years of silence, guilt, and things no man should have ignored. 2 hours earlier, she'd been leaving the House chamber when a man caught her arm near the east steps. Mid-30s. Trim but tense. No name. Just the cracked knuckles and darting eyes of someone carrying a truth too long. "You're the only one I trust," he whispered, shoving the folder into her satchel with trembling hands. They told him. I was there. We all were. Back in her office, Jasmine's hands hovered over the clasp. The hallway noise faded, the laughter of interns. The clicking heels of aides, the muffled cable news TVs all disappeared. It was just her, the folder, and a decision that could rupture the floor of Congress. She opened it. 8 sworn affidavits, each one bearing a name she didn't recognize, just initials. JRTMCA. One after another, the stories spilled across the pages like identical nightmares. Locker rooms, exam tables, hushed warnings to coaches, and then nothing. No investigation, no protection. Just shrugs, jokes, silences that echoed louder than screams. Halfway through the 3rd affidavit, Jasmine felt her throat tighten. One line hit harder than the rest. "I told Coach Jordan." He said, "Don't start drama." That was 1994. I never spoke of it again. She pushed her chair back, rose slowly, and stared out her office window overlooking Constitution Avenue. The city hummed with power and indifference. But Jasmine had been raised differently. Her father taught her that truth was like fire, dangerous when contained, purifying when unleashed. She returned to the folder. Paper clipped to the back cover was a memo from Ohio State's legal office dated July 3, 2019. Subject: congressional liability if past abuse testimony resurfaces. Her heart sank. They knew. They all knew. And still Jordan climbed the ranks, bellowing about accountability while standing on the bones of the boys he left behind. But this wasn't just a political opportunity. It was a test. Jasmine walked to the corner of her office where a locked drawer held past letters, constituents begging for justice. A mother whose son overdosed because no one took his abuse seriously. A teacher fired for reporting a predator. A 15-year-old girl who wrote, "I stayed quiet because I saw what happened to others who didn't." She returned to her chair and stared at the folder like it might start breathing. "If I say it," she whispered, "the room explodes. If I stay silent, it happens again." Outside, thunder rolled over the Capitol dome. Inside, she began marking up the pages, yellow tabs on names, red underlines on timelines, blue highlights on quotes she would use like blades. Tomorrow's judiciary hearing had Jordan listed as lead questioner. Perfect. He wouldn't see it coming. He never did. Because men like him believed in attack, not defense. And no one had ever put him under oath until now. Jasmine closed the folder, took a deep breath, and whispered to no one, "Let's see how the man who demands accountability handles it when it's his turn in the chair." The camera was coming, the nation was watching, and the silence. It was about to break. The hearing room felt like a pressure cooker dressed in mahogany. Bright overhead lights glared down on polished wood and polished lies bouncing off Jordan's signature rolled-up sleeves as he swaggered in like he owned the air itself. Staffers shuffled quickly to clear his path. Cameras clicked as reporters jostled for angles. He smiled that trademark grin, a weapon disguised as charm, and dropped his file on the table with a self-satisfied thud. Jasmine Crockett was already seated, still, centered, silent, not passive waiting. She didn't look up as he entered, but she felt the vibration of his presence like a boxer feeling the ring shift under his opponent's weight. She knew his rhythm better than he did, the explosive tone changes, the theatrical pauses, the finger-pointing moralism wrapped in fire and fury. It was all performance, all bluster, and it had worked until now. She glanced down at her own file. No theatrical flair, no grandstanding lines, just truth weaponized, sworn affidavits that didn't yell, they cut. She wasn't here to play Jordan's game. She was here to end it. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the hearing was gavelled into order. Jordan leaned forward like a predator about to pounce. This hearing, he announced, is about restoring justice in a department that's been weaponized against the American people. The words echoed off the chamber walls like a sermon, met with nods from Republican committee members and blank stares from Democrats who'd heard it all before. Jasmine didn't blink. She wasn't listening for what he said, she was timing how he said it. His cadence was perfect for spectacle: start with outrage, move into accusation, end with a question he'd never let anyone answer. The same script, every time. But not today. Her father's voice came to her, steady and low, the way he used to speak before a courtroom cross in a furnace full of liars. Baby girl, be the still flame. Not loud, not wild, but unshakable. That's what she was now, a flame curled tight, waiting. Jordan barreled forward. The American people deserve transparency. They deserve accountability. And today we're going to demand it loudly. He looked directly across the dais, daring any Democrat to interrupt. But Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet. She just tilted her head slightly, watching him build his stage, every sentence adding another rope to his own snare. He didn't realize it, but he was walking into a cross-examination that had started the moment he opened his mouth. She knew the timing. She knew the weight of silence. She knew when to let a man hang himself with his own righteousness. A staffer slipped her a note. She didn't glance at it. Her eyes were locked now, not on Jordan, but on the clock behind him. Each second that passed brought them closer to the point of no return. Jordan pulled out a highlighted printout and waved it for the cameras. Where is the outrage when this administration targets conservatives but protects their own? This is political warfare, and the American people see it for what it is. A beat of silence. Jasmine slowly reached for her pen, not to write, but to hold it like a conductor waiting for the downbeat. She could feel her heart pounding, but her face was still. Calm, a storm behind glass. Because the thing about traps is they don't spring with sound, they spring with silence. Jordan leaned back confident. I yield back my time. And that right there was the opening she'd waited for. She adjusted her mic, lifted her eyes, and met his directly across the room. And for the first time, Jim Jordan didn't look like a man preparing for battle. He looked like a man about to be called to answer. The flame had found its moment, and the furnace was about to feel the burn. The room had just started to cool from Jordan's tirade, his voice still echoing faintly in the mics, like heat clinging to steel after the flame dies down. He sat back smugly, fingers tapping his notes like a drummer, rehearsing his next attack line. Reporters typed furiously. The C-SPAN director panned to the Republican side, expecting the usual rhythms: shout, smirk, repeat. But then a voice, calm but laced with voltage, sliced through the chamber. Mr. Chairman, Jasmine Crockett said, not raising her tone, but stealing the air from the room. I just have a brief point of clarification. The chair looked surprised. Democrats rarely interrupted Jordan. They preferred to let him burn himself out. But Jasmine had waited for this silence, crafted it, cultivated it. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized. Jordan shifted in his seat, the corners of his mouth twitching upward, already annoyed, already prepared to swat away whatever was coming. He adjusted his sleeves like a man expecting a harmless breeze. Jasmine leaned forward. Her voice didn't rise, but it landed. Mr. Jordan, you've spent the last 15 minutes talking about accountability, about justice, about consequences for those in positions of authority who fail to act when wrongdoing is reported. Her gaze locked with his. Would you agree that when someone is made aware of abuse and they ignore it or cover it up, they should be held accountable? The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Jordan blinked. Cameras clicked once, then stopped. Even the staffers typing paused mid-keystroke. Yes, he said slowly, trying to sound decisive. Absolutely. That's the whole point of this hearing. She nodded just once, and the nod wasn't acknowledgement. It was a silent countdown. Because the trap had just closed. Jordan, the man who had perfected political prosecution, had just handed her the opening statement of her case. The Republicans on the panel smiled faintly, thinking Jasmine had played into his hands. The Democrats stiffened, sensing something was shifting, but unsure of what. Jordan leaned in, prepared to reclaim the floor. "Glad we agree," he said, voice swelling. "Because too often people in power think they can get away with—" "I'm not finished," Jasmine cut in surgically. "You said people in power must be held accountable when they fail to protect the vulnerable. So let me ask again, clearly. Do you believe that even members of Congress who ignored reports of abuse should face consequences?" The words hit like a slap across marble. Jordan's eyes darted. His smirk cracked just slightly. "That's a hypothetical," he started. "No, sir," she said. "It's not." The pause that followed wasn't just silence, it was suspension, as if gravity itself had paused to listen. A congressional hearing had become a courtroom, and the prosecutor had just risen from the defense bench. Across the gallery, a journalist's pen fell to the floor. No one moved to pick it up. The most feared interrogator in the House was suddenly answering questions, and he didn't know what evidence the other side held. Jordan opened his mouth, but the moment didn't belong to him anymore. What happens when the man shouting for justice realizes the spotlight was never on the accused, but on him? The room hadn't recovered from the question. Not really. The silence still lingered like smoke after an explosion, dense, charged, and waiting for the next detonation. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. She let the moment breathe, let the anticipation curl through every corner of the hearing chamber. Then, without raising her voice, she reached for the folder. A slow, deliberate motion. No dramatics, just precision. "Since we're in agreement about accountability," she said, unfolding the pages with surgeon-like calm, "I believe the committee will want to consider this." Jordan narrowed his eyes. Jasmine held up the cover of the document, bold black letters stamped across the front: Philadelphia, Ohio State University. Civil case number 2, 18 CV 0076. A few in the gallery shifted. The more experienced reporters stopped typing. They knew that file, or thought they did. "This," Jasmine continued, "is Exhibit A." She didn't look at Jordan, not yet. She began to read. Multiple student athletes reported to coaching staff, including defendant Jordan, that Dr. Richard Strauss had engaged in sexually inappropriate conduct during medical examinations. Despite these reports, no meaningful action was taken by the staff. The abuse continued unchecked. The room went still. Palms froze over keyboards. A low mechanical hum from the overhead lights suddenly sounded deafening. Jordan flinched, not visibly, not enough for headlines, but enough for C-SPAN's high-definition lens to catch a tremor in his jaw and the quick, involuntary swallow of a man who's just heard his own name in a sentence that could undo everything. Jasmine didn't pause. Plaintiffs alleged that coaching staff, including Mr. Jordan, were directly informed of misconduct on multiple occasions between 1987 and 1995. No incident report was filed. No complaint was escalated. Athletes were told to toughen up, stop causing trouble, or were outright ignored. She flipped to the next page, her hands steady, her voice even, but her words sliced like piano wire. Jordan shifted in his seat. His hand went to the stack of papers before him, as if looking for something to grip. But his notes were useless now. This wasn't about committee talking points. This was about history, and now it was public record. Across the room, a Republican aide whispered into a colleague's ear. The chairman leaned back, lips pressed together, eyes unmoving. The C-SPAN director switched angles. First to Jasmine's eyes, focused unblinking, then to Jordan's face, now pale under the unforgiving lights. "Let me be clear," Jasmine said, her voice dipped in steel. "These are not vague accusations whispered in a hallway. These are sworn affidavits, court-filed, backed by names, dates, and trauma." Her gaze turned to Jordan, slow as a solar eclipse. "And they mention you, not once, not in passing, repeatedly." Jordan opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came. The trap had moved to its second phase. This wasn't just rhetorical entrapment. It was legal exposure. On record, on camera, on the internet, within minutes. Jasmine tapped the file once, like a gavel against silence. The question isn't whether abuse happened. That's established. The question is, what did you know and why didn't you act? A beat passed. And in that beat, the entire room understood Jim Jordan wasn't the questioner anymore. He was the witness. And the trial had just begun. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The quiet in the room had become its own kind of violence-piercing, deliberate, inescapable. She stood now not for dramatics, but to honor what was coming. A list. A reckoning. 8 names. 8 echoes that had once been silenced by institutional indifference. She unfolded a second sheet thinner than the lawsuit, but heavier in weight. James R. She began, her voice a scalpel. Reported to assistant coach in 1993. Told it was locker room hazing. A pause, then a second name. Carlos A. reported in 1991. Coach responded, "Don't start drama, you can't finish." Murmurs rippled at the edges of the chamber, but Jasmine kept reading, her eyes locked on Jordan, who now looked less like a congressman and more like a defendant who hadn't studied for cross. Thomas M., she continued, told Mr. Jordan directly in 1994 about Dr. Strauss's exams. Coach laughed and said, "Don't be soft." Jordan shifted again. Not subtle now. His collar twitched under his suit. A drop of sweat rolled from temple to cheek. The hearing room, designed for control and decorum, was beginning to feel like a slow-motion courtroom in the middle of a verdict. Brian E. Jasmine said, Matthew S., Kevin L., Nathan D., Isaac W. Each name felt like a strike against marble. No theatrics, no trembling. Just truth, clean, sharp, undeniable. She placed the paper down. 8 young men, she said softly, who spoke up, who followed every protocol, every chain of command, every ounce of courage they had left, and were met with silence. Jordan tried to inhale a defense, tried to conjure the voice he'd built his career on, but it came out fractured. I never saw anything, he said. A flicker of relief swept across his face, like he believed that was enough. Jasmine didn't blink. Her reply came like lightning through iron. They didn't say you saw Mr. Jordan. They said they told you. The chamber exhaled sharply, like the truth had cut through oxygen itself. And you, she continued, stepping forward, now chose to laugh, to dismiss, to walk away. Jordan's mouth opened again, but nothing emerged. The man known for shouting others into submission now sat mute, visibly rattled, his eyes darting for allies in a room that had turned hostile by truth alone. You've built an entire political persona on demanding others be held accountable. You've interrupted doctors, yelled at intelligence officials, demeaned colleagues for not doing enough. She leaned in. And yet when 8 vulnerable men, boys, really came to you, not once, not twice, but over the course of years, you did nothing. Jordan gripped his pen, snapped it. Ink spilled across his fingers. The C-SPAN director caught it live. Jasmine returned to her seat without flourish, her last words hanging in the air like the final toll of a bell. 8 names, Mr. Jordan. 1 silence, and it was yours. She didn't need to say anything more. Because in that room, in that moment, America wasn't watching a congresswoman challenge a colleague. They were watching justice reclaim its voice. Jasmine didn't raise the volume, she raised the stakes. Her hand moved slowly across the folder again, fingers sliding under a paper-clipped stack of printouts, each one lined in red and yellow ink. Not legal documents this time, not affidavits. These were words, his words, pulled from speeches, interviews, committee, tirades, quotes he'd spat like moral thunder over the years now, weaponized with surgical precision. She adjusted the mic, eyes steady on the man across from her. I'd like to quote the gentleman from Ohio. She began, her voice composed but merciless. July 17, 2019. When someone in authority ignores credible reports of abuse, they are just as guilty as the abuser themselves. Jordan's spine stiffened, like someone had yanked a wire through him. He looked down, not at her, but at the floor, as if gravity had turned against him. November 5, 2020. Jasmine continued, flipping to the next page without pause. Accountability means everyone left right, powerful, powerless answers for their failures when it comes to protecting children. The room shifted. The Republicans stopped looking at their phones. The Democrats froze, half in awe, half in disbelief. Staffers weren't even pretending to whisper anymore. Everyone was listening. Everyone was watching. Jordan's fingers twitched, searching for something to hold. He grabbed his pen, but it slid from his hand, hit the table, and rolled off the edge. The sound of it hitting the floor was microscopic, but in that stillness, it rang like a gavel of guilt. From the press box, one reporter tapped her colleague and mouthed, "He's breaking." Jasmine didn't stop. March 12, 2021. If we excuse silence in the face of abuse, we invite it to happen again. Leadership demands courage, not complicity. Jordan tried to speak. His lips parted, but only air came out like a man trying to shout underwater. He blinked fast, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight. The shield of bluster he wore like armor for decades was cracked now, hairline fractures spreading with every syllable she repeated back to him. From across the aisle, one Democratic staffer glanced at their phone and texted 2 words to a friend. She cracked him. Jasmine laid the final sheet flat on the table and leaned in, not out of aggression, but with the unshakable stillness of someone who had waited her whole life for this moment. This isn't about party lines. This isn't about cable news. This is about a man who demanded the world answer to his standard until it was his turn. She looked him dead in the eye, and when it came, he fell silent. Jordan gripped the arms of his chair like it might anchor him to something solid, but the tide was already pulling him under. Jasmine sat back slowly. She didn't smirk. She didn't grandstand. She simply let his own words sit in the air, echoing back at him like ghosts from a mirror he couldn't escape. Can a man survive a mirror made of his own words, or does it cut deeper than anything anyone else could ever say? For a man who'd built his brand on noise, Jim Jordan had never felt sound quite this loud. The silence was unbearable. Not the kind that invited reflection, but the kind that suffocates where every breath feels like a confession. He sat frozen eyes darting across the dais, looking for an escape route that no longer existed. His fingers hovered above the stack of paper he brought, pages filled with preloaded attacks, now useless debris, in a courtroom he never meant to enter. He tried to speak, opened his mouth, closed it again. Nothing. Not even a deflection. From the corner of the table, one of his aides stood and subtly slipped a folded note into his palm. Jordan barely looked at it. He crumpled it without reading and shoved it aside with a sharp twitch, like the paper itself burned. And across from him, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward just slightly and delivered a whisper that felt like a thunderclap. "You would have demanded they testify. So why won't you?" Jordan's shoulders tensed like a man struck by lightning. C-SPAN's live feed didn't need commentary. The frame said it all. Jasmine calm, Jordan crumbling. The man who once thundered over hearings with moral fury now sat hunched like a scolded boy in detention, surrounded by the consequences of his own doctrine. He rubbed his temple, rubbed harder, as if trying to pressurize a lie into something he could say aloud. But no script could save him now. His playbook, interrupt, intimidate, override, had been shredded by facts and silence. The committee chair cleared his throat awkwardly, unsure whether to intervene or let history unfold uninterrupted. Reporters watched through narrowed eyes, capturing the collapse in real time. One of them whispered into her recorder, "We've never seen him like this. Never." Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't need to twist the knife. She had already gutted the illusion. Everything now was fallout gravity, dragging the wreckage of reputation into the open for everyone to see. Jordan reached for his water glass. His hand shook. He missed the cup the first time. The visual was devastating. Behind him, a staffer stared down at his own shoes, unable to meet the camera's gaze. Another Republican whispered something into a colleague's ear. They didn't smile. They didn't defend him. In that moment, Jordan wasn't just losing the argument, he was losing them. Jasmine folded the final page of quotes, slow and clean, and set it aside. No flourish, just finality. "You've held others to a standard that you're now too afraid to face," she said, voice low but cutting. "That's not leadership. That's cowardice wrapped in outrage." The words echoed in the hearing room like a bell tolling at dawn, soft but irreversible. Jordan sank back in his chair, no longer gripping anything. His hands rested limp on the desk, palms open, like a man who'd finally realized there were no more weapons left to hold. And the audience, those watching at home, those whispering in the gallery, those waiting to clip the next viral second, realized something all at once. The man who always controlled the room had just lost it entirely. Jasmine didn't move fast. She didn't need to. Every second she took now was a countdown the whole nation could feel. A camera panned closer. Another adjusted for a profile shot. Jim Jordan sat motionless, his hands gripping the edges of his seat like he might fall through it. His eyes, once sharp and confrontational, now flicked downward, searching for something invisible that might rewrite this moment. Jasmine lifted a single page slowly. No courtroom dramatics, no fanfare. Just the deliberate rhythm of someone loading one final round into a chamber. 2018, she began. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. That kind of stillness that follows a storm, but before the bodies are counted. A congressional hearing on child abuse in sports. You, Mr. Jordan, delivered this quote during opening remarks. She looked up not at him, but at the room as if speaking for someone who wasn't there. Then she read it. Silence in the face of abuse is complicity. Her voice didn't crack. It cut. The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Jordan didn't flinch this time. He froze. The kind of freeze that comes not from defiance, but from recognition. He remembered saying it. America remembered hearing it. And now with cameras rolling, those words had come back not as applause lines, but as evidence. Jasmine lowered the page gently to the desk. And then she paused. It wasn't just for effect. It was out of respect for the 8. Her voice softened, not in weakness, but in tribute. 8 young men stayed silent for decades, she said, letting each syllable land. They feared retaliation, disbelief, shame, and the system gave them every reason to. She looked at Jordan for the first time in minutes, eyes sharp, unwavering. But today, she continued, they spoke. Through affidavits, through risk, through courage. The silence in the chamber deepened this time, not with tension, but with something else. Reverence. C-SPAN's director switched angles again. One shot on Jasmine's face, unwavering. Another tight on Jordan's hands, now limp, stained with blue pen ink, and the unmistakable tremble of a man undone by his own standards. Jasmine stood still, not triumphant, just resolute. You said silence was complicity, she repeated. And today, silence met its reckoning. Jordan didn't speak, couldn't, not when the weight of his own words had just been laid across his chest like a verdict. Across America, phones buzzed. Clips were already circulating, not because of yelling, not because of insults, but because a lion had been turned to a lamb live and without a single punch thrown. And as Jasmine stepped back, still silent, still composed, the audience realized they weren't just watching politics. They were watching a man confront a truth he could no longer outrun, and the woman who finally made him face it. The air in the room felt heavier than protocol could hold. No one moved. No one dared break the silence Jasmine had carved from stone. Across the table, Jim Jordan sat motionless, sweat tracing a silent confession down the side of his temple. His breathing had changed, not the loud, assertive huffs of the aggressor, but the shallow pulls of a man cornered by memory and truth. The chairman glanced down, fingers drumming nervously against the hardwood. Then, clearing his throat with the uncertainty of someone interrupting a funeral, he asked, "Does the gentleman from Ohio wish to respond?" Jordan blinked. The cameras leaned in as if they too held their breath. His lips parted. For a fraction of a second, the old fire tried to surface. He reached for outrage, for volume, for deflection, but nothing came. No anger, no denial, just the raw awareness that the playbook no longer applied. He looked down, voice barely above a whisper. "I have nothing further." The words struck like a wrecking ball in reverse, not loud, not violent, but final. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't even move. Because this wasn't victory, it was exposure. The kind that leaves nothing left to hide behind. The silence that followed was surgical. Staffers stared wide-eyed. Some Republican aides began typing frantically, phones lighting up across the bench. One Democrat leaned back, exhaled, and whispered to no one in particular, "It's done." But outside that chamber, the real detonation had already begun. Social media lit up like a battlefield flare. Hashtag Jordan silenced. Hashtag Crockett. Crushed him. Hashtag The Reckoning Live. Within 60 seconds, the clip hit Twitter. Within 3 minutes, TikTok had split-screen reactions. Memes erupted. A side-by-side of Jordan screaming at Fauci in 2021 cut to his empty, broken expression today. Caption, how it started. how it ended. Late-night show producers were already writing monologue jokes. Newsrooms held urgent editorial meetings. Push notifications flooded phones breaking. Jordan left speechless after brutal confrontation by Reverend Crockett. And in living rooms across the country, something rare happened. People stopped, watched, replayed. Not because of volume, but because of what wasn't said. Because for once, a man who had turned every microphone into a weapon had nothing to say when it turned on him. Inside the chamber, the chair attempted to resume proceedings, but the energy had shifted. Jordan, once the storm, now looked like the debris it left behind. Even his fellow Republicans avoided eye contact. His collapse was too naked, too real to ignore. Jasmine sat back, not victorious, not vindictive, just steady. Like the calm after sirens fade and truth remains. She had turned mirrors into microphones, made silence into indictment, and left America with one haunting question. What happens when the man who never shut up finally does? It didn't take long. The moment Jordan uttered those 4 words, "I have nothing further," the internet inhaled and exploded. Within 60 seconds, the clip was clipped, captioned, and climbing. The C-SPAN footage, raw and unscripted, now lived in 1,000 formats, slowed down, zoomed in, subtitled, and soundtracked like a courtroom thriller. And everywhere, one face remained still at the center: Jasmine Crockett's. Twitter was the first to combust. A viral meme showed 2 frames side by side, Jordan mid-rage at a past hearing, finger raised, face red, captioned how it started. Next to it, the image from today, him, pale, deflated eyes dropped, captioned how it's going. Another post had Jasmine's final quote superimposed over a black and white still of the hearing room. 8 names, 1 silence, and it was yours. It got 600,000 likes in 5 hours. On TikTok, edits turned her takedown into rhythm-driven political choreography layered over orchestral builds and Kanye beats. On Instagram, civil rights orgs shared her image beside Thurgood Marshall and Barbara Jordan. She hadn't just won a moment, she had stepped into a legacy. But somewhere between the applause and the chaos, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her apartment, staring at her phone screen like it might crack open. 250,000 new followers. Her name trending worldwide. Emails flooding in news segments. Bookers' endorsement requests, national platforms, college, lectures, cable contracts, influencer outreach. All of it coming faster than she could scroll. She should have felt triumphant, but she didn't, because it wasn't supposed to be about her. Outside her window, DC traffic blurred under golden streetlights, business as usual in a city that feeds on blood and claps for the kill. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, the faint glow of the screen casting lines across her face. The notifications pinged like fireworks, but her heart didn't rise with them. She opened one of the forwarded clips, a slow zoom on Jordan's expression, when he realized the mirror had turned. The audience had loved it, but Jasmine watched it like a coroner studying a still heart, not with glee, with quiet weight. This wasn't theater. These were 8 men who'd waited 3 decades to be believed, and it had taken their pain weaponized through law, silence, and composure to finally bring down a man who'd made a career of avoiding questions. A soft buzz shook her palm, another message. It was from one of the survivors. Just 5 words, "You made it matter again." Her breath caught. That right there was the only metric that counted. She put the phone down, let her eyes close for a moment, because tomorrow would bring lights, spin interviews, questions. But tonight she sat in the aftershock of impact, somewhere between pride and heartbreak, between vengeance and justice, between silence shattered and a truth finally heard. And outside, the internet kept burning. A fire Jasmine never lit, but one she had finally allowed to catch. The statement dropped just after midnight. It wasn't from a political figure or a strategist or a journalist chasing virality. It was from the 8. 8 survivors. 8 men whose names had lived too long in sealed courtrooms and therapy offices. The email was brief, typed in plain text, signed collectively, but every word carved into the public like a chisel against marble. Congresswoman Crockett did what Jim Jordan never did. She listened. That was all it took. By sunrise, every network was running it as a headline. No spin, no qualifiers. Just the raw truth of men who had once screamed into silence and were now echoing across America. But inside Jasmine Crockett's office, the world outside felt far away. She sat at her desk, blinds drawn, the morning light barely cutting through the edges. The statement was printed and placed on the table in front of her, creases forming where her fingers had gripped the page too long. She had read it 7 times. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because reading it once didn't feel real. Maybe because reading it again made it hurt more. She reached for another paper nearby. It was a copy of something one survivor had sent her weeks ago, before the hearing, before the headlines, before the collapse. A letter. Not addressed to her, addressed to his younger self. She unfolded it slowly, as if it might disintegrate in her hands. You weren't weak. You weren't broken. They were. They were too afraid to act, too comfortable to care, too powerful to listen. But one day someone will hear you not as a victim, but as a witness to a system that let monsters hide in daylight. Jasmine's hand trembled as she folded the letter back. She pressed it to her chest, not performatively, not for anyone else, but because the weight of those words had finally found a home. The silence in the room was absolute. No cameras, no tweets, no noise. And that's when it happened. The first tear. It slipped down her cheek slowly, unnoticed at first, like a thread finally snapping after holding up too much for too long. She didn't wipe it, didn't hide it. Let it fall. Because that's what this moment was not. Triumph, not political gain, not spectacle. It was the breaking of something ancient, the undoing of silence, the return of stolen dignity. Her shoulders didn't shake. Her breath stayed steady. But in the stillness of that room, something broke open, not in weakness, in release, in truth. Outside, journalists were refreshing news feeds, analysts were parsing votes, influencers were stitching sound bites. But none of it matched the raw human truth inside that office. That when a voice long buried is finally heard, it doesn't echo, it heals. And in that quiet, Jasmine understood, the real victory wasn't making Jim Jordan silent. It was giving the voiceless a name that finally spoke back. The storm had passed, but the wreckage still smoked. 3 days after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett walked into the Capitol's press briefing room with a folder that looked almost identical to the one that started it all. But this time the pages inside weren't testimony, they were legislation. Her heels struck the marble like a war drum. No fanfare, no theatrics, just resolve dressed in black. The room was packed, reporters, activists, survivors, even 3 Republican aides sitting in the back row, visibly nervous but present. Jasmine stepped to the podium, placed the folder down, and looked straight into the sea of blinking red lights. This isn't about one man, she said. This is about a culture that rewards silence, deflection, and cowardice in the face of abuse. She opened the folder. I'm introducing the Public Accountability Act. This bill would require all federal officials, elected or appointed, who are named in credible abuse-related allegations to testify under oath in front of congressional oversight. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just bold, it was explosive. Silence, she continued, isn't just protection of predators. It becomes the crime. Behind her 2 Democratic co-sponsors stood solemnly. But what turned heads, what made reporters grip their pens tighter, was the third figure who stepped up beside her, Congressman Richard Halverson, Republican, Ohio. The same party, the same state, the same committee. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He simply nodded and said, I saw what silence looked like. I don't want to be a part of it anymore. It was a fracture, small, but visible, and in Washington, fractures become floods. By nightfall, 4 more Republicans voiced cautious support for the bill. Not out of political strategy, but because the reckoning was no longer theoretical. Jordan's collapse had made it real. No one wanted to be the next clip going viral with nothing to say under fire. Jasmine returned to her office exhausted, her inbox flooded with messages, some hopeful, some hateful, all loud. But amid the digital noise, one voicemail played in her mind on repeat. My daughter was assaulted by someone protected by a school board. She asked me, why doesn't anyone ever go under oath? Thank you for making it a requirement. She leaned back in her chair, eyes closed, the weight of legacy pressing against her ribs. This wasn't over. In fact, it had barely begun. Passing the bill would be trench warfare. But for the first time, the trench had a voice in it that refused to be quiet. And outside that office across the country, institutions were already whispering to themselves, auditing, past silence, preparing excuses, tightening legal shields. Because they knew what was coming. This time the fire had a name, and it wouldn't flicker out. When silence is shattered, who dares to speak next? The messages didn't stop. By the fourth night, Jasmine Crockett's inbox had become a battleground of fury. The emails came in waves, subject lines screaming in all caps. Red text, anonymous addresses, bile disguised as patriotism. One letter arrived in an unmarked envelope with just 5 words scratched in black ink. "Your next Congresswoman." Watch it. She didn't flinch when she read it. Not right away. But the tremor in her coffee cup as she placed it back down betrayed something deeper, something tightening. Fox News aired 3 back-to-back segments that night. They didn't say her name with fire, they said it with venom. Radical freshman, political opportunist. She ambushed a good man. Their hosts smirked through the screen, asking viewers if she had an agenda, if this was all just theater. Meanwhile, in the corners of Facebook and Truth Social, her face was plastered onto crosshairs and burning flags, doctored and looped under phrases like "traitor in heels." At 11:47 p.m., her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. But the name on the screen stopped her cold mom. "Baby," the voice came choked and trembling. "What did you do?" Jasmine closed her eyes, leaning against the kitchen counter, the marble suddenly colder than it should have been. "I told the truth, Ma," she whispered. Her mother's breath cracked through the receiver. "You think that's enough? You think they care about the truth? They'll come after you next. They'll ruin you." For a moment, Jasmine couldn't speak, not because she didn't have a response, but because part of her wasn't sure. Had she broken something sacred, a rule, a rhythm? In Washington, there are things you don't say out loud. You dance around them, let them rot politely behind closed doors. She hadn't just spoken, she'd named names, forced eyes open, cracked the glass. And now the shards were flying. She hung up gently, sat down on the floor, her back against the wall. The shadows of the city blinked through her window, red lights from ambulances, the pulse of distant sirens. The world kept moving. But inside her chest, the question spiraled like a knife without a handle. Did I fix something, or did I just break it louder? Her phone buzzed again. A DM this time. From a young woman in Michigan. Anonymous account. Just a message. "He hurt me too. Thank you for not letting him yell his way out of it." Jasmine stared at it. Her eyes stung. She didn't cry this time, but she finally breathed. Because even when the walls close in and the wolves circle, there is one truth you can't threaten away. When silence breaks, echoes always follow. The diner was quiet, too quiet for a city that never truly slept. Jasmine sat in the corner booth, coat still on, head down, fingers absent-mindedly circling the rim of her glass. It was the first time in days she wasn't surrounded by flashing cameras, acid-tipped questions, or the hum of capital tension. Just fluorescent lights, the hiss of a coffee machine, and the low clatter of forks on plates. She wasn't hiding. She was breathing. Until a shadow approached the table, tentative, shaking slightly. A young woman, maybe 22, stood just beyond reach, a backpack still slung over one shoulder, breath uneven like she'd been pacing outside for hours. "I'm sorry," the girl began, voice cracking. "But I saw you in there. On TV. At the hearing." Jasmine looked up, already preparing a polite smile, maybe a deflection. But then she saw something raw in the girl's eyes. Not awe, not fandom. Recognition. The girl swallowed hard. "I'm in law school, 2nd year. Honestly, I was about to drop out. I thought it didn't matter, truth, the law, any of it. But then I saw you stand there, and I heard what you said, and I watched that man go silent, and her voice broke. You made me believe truth matters again." The world narrowed to that moment. All the noise, the threats, the headlines gone. Jasmine gestured gently. "Sit." They talked. Not politics, not policy, but purpose. The girl told her about growing up watching courtroom dramas with her dad, about how she used to think lawyers were superheroes until real-life systems showed her otherwise. About a professor who once told her, "Don't expect justice in court, just procedure." And Jasmine listened, really listened, until the girl finally asked, almost embarrassed, What made you start a memory surfaced. Crisp, unshaken by time. She was 26, a brand new public defender in Dallas. Her first real trial. A black teen charged with assaulting a security guard, except the footage told a different story. Jasmine stood in that courtroom trembling behind a folder twice too thick and carved the truth into the room like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The verdict came back not guilty. The boy's mother hugged her so tight she couldn't breathe. That night, Jasmine didn't celebrate. She sat in her car for an hour and cried not because she won, but because he didn't lose to silence. I started, Jasmine told the girl, because no one else in the room looked like they believed him, and I needed someone too. The girl nodded, mist in her eyes. Then I'm going back. To law school. For real this time. They parted with no photos, no posts, just an understanding. As Jasmine stepped back into the cold night, her breath visible, she realized something simple: power is loud. But belief walks quietly and still rebuilds what fear tried to burn. The candles flickered like tiny defiant hearts against the night. They lined the courthouse steps, dozens at first, then hundreds, each flame cradled in trembling hands, each glow honoring a name once buried in bureaucracy and shame. Survivors stood shoulder to shoulder, some with eyes closed, others watching the horizon as if waiting for dawn to prove this moment was real. Reporters had been told to stay back. No podium, no microphones, just light breath and memory. Jasmine hadn't planned to speak. She'd told her team she couldn't. This wasn't her story. It belonged to the 8 and the thousands behind them whose names never made it to print. But someone handed her a folded paper, then quietly stepped away. It was blank, and maybe that was the point. So she walked forward. The crowd parted not out of reverence but recognition. They had seen what she'd done, and they needed to know if she still stood behind it, now that the fire was burning both ways. She stepped onto the top stair, looked out, took a breath that felt like it weighed 300 years. I didn't come here to give a speech, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. But sometimes silence is more dangerous than anything we could say. She looked down at the candles. They say silence is neutral, that it protects peace, protects process. But that's a lie. Her voice climbed not in anger, but in clarity. Silence is a cocoon for power. It wraps itself in respectability and red tape. It tells victims to wait for the right moment, the right forum, the right tone. She scanned the faces in front of her, tear-streaked, shivering, unblinking. And today, she continued, we ripped it open. A few sobs broke from the crowd. A survivor near the front pressed both palms against his face and began to shake. Jasmine's voice softened again. I watched a man who never listened finally go silent. And not because he was silenced by someone else, but because the weight of ignored voices finally found him. She paused. The wind picked up. A few candles went out, but most remained. We talk about justice like it's a system, but it's not. It's a choice. One we either make with courage or betray with silence. A long breath, a longer silence. Then the last words, the ones she hadn't written. So I ask you, what are we still protecting by staying quiet? The crowd stood still. No applause, no chants, just the sound of wind and breath and broken silence. And in that stillness, something old unraveled. Something new began. Because the speech she never wanted to give wasn't just a call to truth. It was a funeral for complicity, and the first stone laid on a path none of them would walk alone again. The letter arrived under seal, thick, formal, and unmistakably weighted. It bore the gold trim of the House Ethics Committee, stamped with urgency and consequence. By mid-morning, the news was public. Congress had opened a formal inquiry into Jim Jordan's conduct during his tenure at Ohio State. It wasn't just about what was said in that hearing room anymore. It was about what wasn't said for decades. Jordan struck back within hours. In a dimly lit video posted to social media, he looked haggard but defiant, standing in front of a flag and flanked by silence. This is a smear campaign, he said, eyes narrowed at the lens. A political hit job by radicals who want to punish me for telling the truth about this administration. He never mentioned the 8 names, never once uttered the word abuse. The internet didn't flinch. It didn't rally behind him this time. The comments were no longer echo chambers, they were battlegrounds. Former staffers, alumni, even quiet Republican voices began to murmur doubts. The narrative was slipping, and Jordan felt it. Jasmine Crockett watched the clip alone, her phone resting against a coffee mug in her office. She didn't react, didn't tweet, didn't flinch. She let the silence speak for her, sharp, surgical, unshakable. Her staff asked if she wanted to respond. She shook her head. Because some fires burn hotter when you feed them. And this one was devouring itself. The committee had subpoena power now. Witnesses were lining up. Whistleblowers were finally answering the phone. The ethics letter was more than an announcement. It was a crack in the armor of a man who thought he'd never have to explain himself under oath. For years, Jordan had demanded accountability with a clenched fist and a raised voice. Now all anyone wanted was his sworn statement, and Jasmine. She just waited, the same way she waited that day in the hearing, calm, unreadable, unyielding. Because sometimes the most devastating truth isn't shouted. It's what remains standing when the noise fades. And her silence wasn't fear. It was strategy. The chamber was half empty when Congressman Daniel Riley, moderate Republican Ohio, stood to speak. Known more for his silence than his stances, Riley had built a career on cautious neutrality. He rarely spoke out of turn, rarely touched controversy. But something had shifted in him since that hearing, something in the way the survivors' names echoed louder than the party line. He cleared his throat, gaze steady, hands not shaking, but not quite still either. If the victims are real, he said slowly, then we owe them truth. Not protection, not deflection, truth. The words landed with weight, not volume. They were quiet, but they cracked the air like lightning across still water. Across the aisle, some Democrats looked up surprised. Reporters paused mid-keystroke. Even Jasmine, watching from her office down the hall, leaned back in her chair, not in shock but recognition. The line had bent, and someone had finally dared to step over it. Riley didn't name Jordan. He didn't have to. He named decency. He named accountability. And in a political climate addicted to theatrics, his calm clarity carried more force than any shouting match on cable news. Within 24 hours, 3 of Jordan's longtime donors suspended their contributions. Another issued a vague statement about reassessing future support pending the investigation. The money wasn't gone, but it was moving. And in Washington, momentum often follows the scent of fear. Conservative radio tried to frame Riley as a traitor, but the people weren't buying it. A viral clip of his floor speech made the rounds captioned, "Finally, a Republican who remembers what a spine is." Constituents in Riley's district, many of them survivors themselves, flooded his office with messages, not anger, not praise. Thanks. Quiet, raw, overdue gratitude. Jordan, meanwhile, said nothing. No statement, no video, no press appearance. The walls that once held his certainty were beginning to lean. And at the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She watched. Not because she needed validation, but because she had always known this wasn't about a party war. It was about moral gravity finally pulling people back to something that felt like justice. And in a town where silence is currency, the first voice from the other side had just broken the bank. The apartment was dark lit only by the faint yellow spill of a street lamp outside. Jasmine sat on the floor beside a half-open box, dusty with time pulled from the back of her closet. Inside were fragments of a life before politics, old notes, high school essays, folded letters she couldn't throw away. And at the bottom, like it had been waiting for this exact moment, was a worn black journal with a cracked spine and her initials carved into the cover. She opened it slowly. The ink had faded, but the words still burned. Be the voice I needed when I was 15. Her breath caught. She remembered exactly where she'd been when she wrote it, sitting cross-legged on her bed, the sound of her parents arguing in the next room, a teacher refusing to believe her side of the story, a counselor who said, just keep your head down and get through it. That was the year she learned that silence wasn't safety, it was surrender. And now, decades later, she realized something that hit deeper than any applause ever could. She hadn't just spoken for the 8 men, she had spoken for herself, for the girl who was never heard, for the teenager who learned to hold her rage in her ribs, who built armor out of restraint and strategy, who wrote in secret because the world hadn't earned her truth yet. Tears slipped quietly down her cheek, but they weren't from sorrow. They were from recognition. The congressional hearing had never been just about Jim Jordan. It had been about memory, recovery, naming the parts of herself that had stayed buried under achievement, under policy, under purpose. All the while, she thought she was protecting others. But in that chamber, she'd finally protected the girl she used to be. She closed the journal gently and pressed it to her chest, not as a keepsake, but as a promise fulfilled. Outside, the city continued on horns, footsteps, the low hum of unresolved noise. But inside her apartment, there was stillness, a sacred kind of quiet. Because for the first time, she wasn't just answering a call for justice, she was answering herself. What part of our past still needs a voice, and what happens when we finally let it speak? The poster hung at the front of the classroom, framed in quiet reverence. It wasn't flashy, just white paper, bold black font, and 41 words that had changed everything. Jasmine's takedown distilled into a single quote, now watched over a room full of teenagers in East St. Louis High like a guardian. The final sentence, underlined in red, read, "You don't get to weaponize silence and call it leadership. Not here. Not anymore." Beneath it, someone had handwritten in pencil. She didn't yell. She didn't flinch. She just spoke. Jasmine hadn't known about the poster until she walked into the classroom, invited for what she thought was a quiet visit. But when the students stood unprompted, unified, she knew this was something else entirely. Their teacher, a wiry man with graying temples and eyes sharp with years of watching cynicism settle in, too young, stepped forward and said softly, "They don't trust politicians, but they trust you now." Jasmine stood in the doorway, unable to speak. The walls were covered with projects, one corner about the Constitution, another about whistleblowers. But it was the quotes from the hearing that dominated the room now. Hand-drawn posters, rewritten testimony, even a mock ethics trial staged by 10th graders who called it the reckoning. She smiled, but it wasn't for show. It was relief, proof. The echo had become a ripple, and the ripple a tide. For the first time in months, the weight she carried didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a bridge. She walked past the desks, slowly locking eyes with students who didn't see her as a politician, but as a mirror of what courage looks like when it chooses calm over noise, truth over spectacle. Because justice didn't need fireworks to be felt. Sometimes it just needed 41 words spoken, plainly held steady and believed by the next generation. And in that moment, Jasmine understood this wasn't about going viral. It was about being remembered not for shouting, but for showing what listening can do. The email came with urgency. CNN wanted her in the studio by 6. Primetime slot, panel debate, exclusive insight. Her staff called it a no-brainer. But Jasmine didn't even open her calendar. She simply closed her laptop, grabbed her coat, and slipped out the side door of her office before anyone could follow. The city buzzed behind her, horns, headlines, lev feeds chasing sound bites. But she wasn't chasing anything. She drove alone, windows, down air cool against her skin. No security detail, no cameras, just the road and a memory pulling her somewhere quieter than applause. The cemetery was small, tucked behind a red brick church in southeast D.C., forgotten by most, but never by her. She parked beneath a weathered oak tree and walked the path she'd memorized years ago. Section C, row 5, third stone from the back, Malik Johnson, 21, accused of theft. No prior convictions, no legal representation until Jasmine took his case as a fresh public defender. He died 3 weeks before the hearing. Heart failure in a holding cell, unreported, unanswered. She knelt beside the stone. No bouquet, no speech, just breath, just presence. Her fingers traced the engraved letters as if trying to make them feel something again. "I didn't forget you," she whispered. Because that hearing, Jordan, the silence, the fire, it wasn't just for 8 men in a courtroom. It was for Malik, and every name that never made the news. The wind moved gently through the trees, scattering dry leaves over her shoes. She closed her eyes. A quiet voice, hers but older worn, floated in the silence. "Not every fight is on camera. Some are in silence and still matter." She stayed there a while. No phone calls, no headlines, just stillness. Because dignity didn't need a podium. It didn't need lights or viral edits or comment threads. It only needed to be remembered. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett chose to remember not the battle she won in the chamber, but the war she was still fighting in the margins. The chamber looked the same, but everything had changed. Same vaulted ceiling, same sharp lighting, same microphone, standing like a sentinel before the witness chair. But this time, Jasmine Crockett wasn't answering a question. She wasn't sparring or prosecuting. She was alone in the room, by choice. The cameras were rolling, but there was no hearing, no opposition. Just a single frame, her seated exactly where she dismantled power, with 41 words. She took a breath, slow and steady, and leaned forward. "You've heard a lot of voices in this room," she said, gaze fixed not on the chair across from her, but on the lens. Angry ones, defensive ones, loud ones, and sometimes empty ones. She paused, letting the silence breathe. But justice doesn't begin with shouting. It begins when someone finally listens. The echo settled. Not thunderous, not sharp, just true. She straightened in her seat, hands folded lightly on the table, the posture of someone no longer fighting to be heard, but ready to let others find their voice. "I didn't speak because I wanted to be right," she said. "I spoke because 8 men waited 30 years for someone to believe them. Because millions more are still waiting." She looked down for a beat, then raised her eyes again, clear, grounded, unwavering. "I learned something in this seat. That silence can be a weapon, but it can also be a mirror. And when we finally see what's in that mirror, we don't just ask what others have done." Her voice softened to a whisper. "We ask what we've ignored." No music, no applause, just breath and light. She rose slowly, her shadow stretching across the floor as she stepped away from the mic. But before she reached the chamber door, she turned back, looked once more into the lens, and left the nation with one final question. What would you say if you finally had the mic? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.